career with CMI Confidence? Well, it all starts with the tools at your fingertips. CMI creates workplaces full of inspiring leaders. With its on-demand resources, network of mentors and industry-leading accreditations. Search CMI Confidence today.
This session is recorded and will be available on the CMI website and YouTube channel. Join the conversation by using the live chat box for your questions and comments. We'll answer as many as we can during the Q&A.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Ethical and Inclusive Leadership Why Does It Matter digital event. My name is Natasha Clegg and I'm an Events Delivery Coordinator at CMI. Don't forget to join in the conversation using the live chat box. We'd love to hear where you're all joining from today, and we'll answer as many questions as we can during the Q&A. I'll now hand over to Sarah to begin today's event.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us today. So you're here to attend our event on ethical and inclusive leadership. Why does it matter? Through attending the event, you'll understand some of the insights about inclusive leadership, learn about impactful practices, and explore the strategic differences that ethical and inclusive leadership can make. I'm one of the regional board members for CMI North East Yorkshire and Humberside board, and also the diversity and inclusion lead. And ethical and inclusive leadership is a central pillar of the CMI professional standards, and it underpins everything that managers do. Most recently, in the Better Managers Report, a survey was conducted by the CMI, and what it found was that 82% of those surveyed had no formal management training. So it's really important that we discuss this topic about ethical and inclusive leadership, the role it plays. And to have that discussion, I am delighted that I have two guests with me today. So our first guest is Caroline Chipperfield. She is the Director of Education Delivery, and she is in a senior leadership position where she works with the NHS, and she is helping in developing that leadership and management capability. So thank you for joining us, Caroline. And our second guest today is Graham Hoy. He is Head of Customer at Betfred. And again, Graham has a role that encompasses, and he feels very passionate about the customer experience and from a marketing perspective as well. So being an ethical and inclusive leader plays a really important part on how he can perform his role and also develop his teams. So thank you both for joining us.
Thank you, Sarah.
The format that we're going to follow is that we'll have some questions for both Caroline and Graham. If you have any comments, any questions, please do put them in the chat, and then we'll come to your questions later. So if I start first, Caroline, I'd like to come to you first. And if you could talk us through your career and why you think ethical and inclusive leadership matters.
Thank you, Sarah, and good morning, everyone. I won't talk you through the whole of my career, but I think to say that I've worked in both private and public sector, and both have a different approach actually to ethical and inclusive leadership. So throughout my career, I have worked in education, I've worked in private schools. I have then moved into operational management in Whitbread, so in the brewing industry and hospitality industry, where I did a lot around recruitment. I'll come back to that. But also then moved into the retail sector of Blockbuster Entertainment UK, and I was latterly their Director of HR for the UK business, working across actually with colleagues in Denmark, Ireland and in Italy. And then 16 years ago, almost 17, I joined the NHS. And I joined the NHS because I wanted to have a shift in a career. I'd never worked in the public sector, or very little time in the public sector in education early in my career, and because I felt it was a value-based place to work in terms of values of the NHS fitted with me and in my world as well. So that brief synopsis, but always had for the last 25, 30 years, HR, organisational development, leadership and recruitment roles within that education and training environment. So I have spent quite a bit of my time teaching, if you like, people in terms of their leadership roles, styles. So hopefully be able to bring some of that out to our session today. But why is this important for me? I think there's sort of three areas, really. One, as a leader within the NHS and the public sector, I was privileged enough to be one of the lead programme managers for Developing People Improving Care, which was absolutely based around how do we develop leaders that are inclusive and compassionate, and based on much of the work of Michael West. If you're familiar with his work, I'm sure many of you will be, within that compassionate and inclusive space. And then there's the three reasons why is that very important to me. I've got one, I am a white female, and I believe that I have a role in inclusion in terms of allyship. So I am very much aware of my own biases. We all have our own biases. And I think in ethical and inclusive leadership, it's really important to know that, but also then to role model and to be that ally across protected characteristics and broader than that in the ethical world. Secondly, as a HR practitioner, I think we have to think about our ethical practices in terms of recruitment and how do we recruit in a way that is inclusive, unbiased. I'm trying to work out how to reduce those biases. And in my work for leading the graduate management training scheme within the NHS, we've actually looked at all of the assessment processes and how do we become more and more inclusive as we do it. So I think recruitment from a HR perspective is really important. And my role as a line manager, and we'll all be line managers within our working lives. So we know that, Sarah, you just touched on some of the work, and in terms of managers, there's a lot about the accidental manager. There's a lot about how do we really build ourselves and our skill sets as managers. But we also know that most people don't leave an organisation, they leave their manager. So I think there's a role as us, as line managers, to be ethical and inclusive in all that we do within our leadership role. So a little bit about me and perhaps three reasons why this is important to me, Sarah. Thank you.
Thanks, Caroline. And that's really interesting. I think the interesting point that stood out for me was around the biases. I think that we all have biases, and to be able to make sure that we are being ethical and inclusive, we need to keep challenging those biases. And that contributes then more positively to the wider discussion as well. And again, from a recruitment, it's a really interesting career journey that you talked about. So I'm sure we'll hear more about some of your experiences and the practices. Now, Graham, if I come to you, fully aware that your experience is in a much different sector, so why do you think that it matters, and what has your experience been?
So first of all, ethical and inclusive leadership, it matters across all industries, particular regulated industries. As leaders, we strive to be inclusive and we strive for an inclusive and diverse working environment. This leadership approach, it allows organizations like ourselves to create a positive work culture where colleagues are valued, respected and empowered. So me, from a personal perspective, it's only then that we can deliver on things like customer experience excellence. Furthermore, integrity and fairness, which for Betfred are brand values, they develop trust and corporate responsibility, corporate reputation. Trust is critical again in customer loyalty, and it's a key factor in consumer decision-making processes. So, and even more so in regulated industries like finance and gambling. At Betfred, we believe in doing the right thing, and that's important throughout the business to ensure that we are customer centric and we fulfill all of our regulatory requirements. So that goes from decisions right at the top through to product design, through to the customer frontline. And I'm going to continue with leaning towards my area of the business, customer experience, where we have a North Star. It's a shared goal that we work towards, and it's consistent. It's no matter where you are, who you are, what you're doing. you're all working towards a shared goal. And it's important that as leaders, we don't, push our own personal values and beliefs, or allow those of a dominant team member to overpower the other team members, and that we have that shared value and work towards it. Also, another point, which is the human experience. So we as a business, we focus strongly on delivering customer and people-centric strategies. One can't exist without the other, and without ethical and inclusive leadership, neither are possible. And finally, just to touch upon the CMI Everybody Economy report, I think that highlights, gender diversity and the correlation between that and innovation. I think they're, key things for me, why it's so important, Sarah.
Thank you, Graham. And that's really interesting. I think you talked about regulated industries and the point about, integrity. And I think, when we talk about ethics and ethical and inclusive leadership, then integrity is a key part of it as well. And aiming for that North Star. And I think more often than not, we think about, and Caroline touched on the public-private sector, but it's the North Star, the shared goal, and thinking about the customer. It's the customer at heart, and how can we enhance that experience? And that experience is then enhanced through that ethical and inclusive leadership. And indeed, the Everyone Economy report, I mean, for those on the call who aren't aware of it, it's definitely something to have a look at, because it highlights what the benefits of inclusive leadership are and how it contributes. And that leads us to one of the questions that I'm going to come to you, Caroline. Could you share some of the impactful practices that you think can be helpful in becoming, ethical and inclusive, in demonstrating that ethical and inclusive leadership?
Thanks, Sarah. So yes, and actually, all the three areas I'm going to talk about are freely accessible through the NHS Leadership Academy website. So Natasha will share any links with you in terms of some of those practices. But it always starts with self, in my view. So self as a leader in terms of the practices. And if we're saying anything, the only thing we can change is ourselves. But there is ways that we can develop those cultures and those practices that will help foster an inclusive and ethical culture and inclusive culture. So the three areas I would like to touch on is our leadership behaviours that we promote within the NHS. It's called our leadership way. Other industries do use it, and many other healthcare uses it in a similar way, but we talk about it through our heart, our head, and our hands. So how do we lead other people? So what is the practice that we can use for that? So through our heart, we think about being compassionate. So we promote and physically promote inclusion, equality, and diversity, and challenge discrimination. So sort of really focused on that through the heart. And we're kind and treat people with respect. I often ask people, encourage people to think best intent and treat people with kindness. I think thank you costs nothing. So there is something around how do we sort of from our heart lead those value-based, but that in compassionate way of leading people. Secondly, we think about our head. So we're curious. So we think about that from a curiosity. We aim for high standards, continuous improvement, and we can be trusted to do what we promise. Going back to what Graham says, how do we sort of build that trust within the relationship? And I often talk about it, particularly some of my work with boards and senior leaders, getting people to be curious and ask questions that seek an answer, not make a judgment. And what do I mean? So the why one can often be that it feels judgmental. So if it's something that you're curious about, when it's ethical and inclusive, it may not have landed with you quite well, but you can be curious and you can ask a question in a very different way. And the third leadership behaviour is about the hands, and that's collaborative. We can't do any of this on our own. We collaborate so that we form partnerships. We've got our shared goals within the NHS. We could just absolutely not do that across health and care, and we cannot do any part of our work without being collaborative and working together. And we also think about that from a share and success perspective in terms of that, our hands, and how do we really promote that? So how do you build those cultures that will lead, if you like, through use of your heart, use of your head, and use of your hands. So that's sort of one practical piece that I would encourage. And on the website, there's questions that you can ask of each other and yourselves to be able to build that culture. I was privileged enough, as I mentioned earlier, about being part of developing People Improving Care that built on the people plan for the NHS, again in the public domain. And we talk about having a people promise. I won't have time to go through all the depth of that today, but just to say there's 7 areas within that. And the first and foremost is about being compassionate and inclusive. So how do you really build that in? That people are recognised and rewarded. So how do you celebrate success? Importantly, people have a voice that counts. So have you got a freedom to speak up policy within your organisation? Do the unheard voices get heard? And is there a way of getting them heard, not just treating it as lip service? Particularly for us within health and care, we are safe and healthy. It is safe to speak up, but it's also safe to talk about perhaps some of the areas that aren't working so well. And how do you do that balance of wellness and well-being? I always talk about always learning as a practice. I always treat every day as a school day. We're never, ever going to stop learning within this. So how do we really do that, which is ethical? And it goes back to perhaps some of my learning about my own biases, about how I've really started to understand fairness and belonging and create that. And then last but not least, within the People Promise, we are a team. So how do you create a team environment, going back to some of that leadership piece? So I think that there is something around the practices that help. Now, we haven't got it all right, and nobody has ever got it all right, but those are what we aspire to do in terms of a leadership way of being, and then the People Promise, which is really something that we're working hard on across 116 of our organisations. And then the third area I'd say about practicing is I am an absolute big fan of Michael West, Professor Michael West, and compassionate inclusive leadership. And there's 7 podcasts on the Academy website that look at different areas, but particularly focused on how do you build a compassionate and inclusive culture that is a just culture within that ethical world across systems when you have no authority to build those, and actually how do you lead without authority and working across that in a compassionate, inclusive way. So those are some of the areas that we've done. And happy to sort of talk about some of the practices that I personally do that we can come later, but I do reciprocal mentoring, and I call it reciprocal because it's not reverse. I learn as much as the person that's mentoring me and vice versa, and I do have those relationships across diverse and inclusive colleagues within my working environment, and I maintain those in terms of it. And we'll often debrief a meeting. How did that feel for you? And it might feel completely different for one of my black female colleagues, same age as me, but it lands very differently me as a white female. So I think it's sort of how do we develop our own practice as well as developing others to create those cultures. I'll pause there, Sarah.
Oh, thank you, Caroline. There was so much really interesting stuff. I mean, I definitely found the leadership behaviors, and I think we've also had some comments in the chat to say that if we could share the material, which we will later today. But it sounds like the heart, head, and hands, it's so important, and it's all, so intricately linked to one another, but it contributes to that whole thing. And again, on the People Promise, I'm not sure I got all 7 of them, but definitely the well-being one is quite a pertinent topic, because having that, at the forefront helps colleagues to feel that that there's a psychological safety, that their well-being is being thought of, and then that nurtures that whole inclusion piece. So really interesting insights. I had heard of reverse mentoring. I'd not heard of reciprocal mentoring, and I think I do like the idea. I think because it's beneficial to both. So again, it's something interesting to think about. And CMI does offer the mentoring element as well. So it's definitely something to explore. Right. I'm going to move on to Graham now. So Graham, what do you think are some of the most impactful practices that you have seen being implemented and you think need to be considered?
Okay. Thank you, Sarah. So I'm speaking on my experience, both within Betfred, but also from open dialogue with colleagues in the Henley Executive MBA program. There are several practices that I feel I've seen being effectively applied. I mean, CMI accredited training is definitely something that we're very passionate about. This year, we're supporting 200 colleagues through CMI accredited courses through Cornell and the Imperial College London. The structured learning that CMI provides through its partners has had a notable impact on our business. Secondly, we touched upon unconscious bias training and using tools such as the Harvard implicit bias test. They're pretty common, and which is really good. And they're also very, we see high engagement across all levels of the business with such training. We also touched upon recruitment, and recruitment is very important. Well, people are critical to any business, right? And that's the basics from ensuring that there are gender balanced or gender equal interview. So interviewers are not the same gender. You've got the right balance there. Implementing scoring systems that consider our own personal unconscious biases. So we're using a scientific approach to recruit the right people, and then embedding employee characteristics into those interview questions. So we know we all have a picture or a vision of what inclusive and ethical looks like, and we should be identifying that at the stage of recruitment, because then it takes the stress away from the challenge of training those after the fact. So recruitment is powerful. And next, I'd say empowerment training and professional coaching for underrepresented groups within the organization. So that's a really effective tool in any organization. At Betfred, we've also used or introduced a reward and recognition program called Beehive. Last year, we introduced it last year, and within a period of 3 months, we've seen over 12,000 employee engagements on there. So that is a tool that can be used, and it's used to promote diversity and inclusion, and it encourages recognition across a wider spectrum. So it's not in your immediate working sort of realm. A really interesting point around reverse mentoring, because I did have it on my list of practices, and I will stand corrected that it should be, I can see the value in it being bi-directional. Pulse surveys are really obvious, and obviously inclusion is always more difficult to measure against versus diversity. But it's the most important things with the pulse surveys when you're measuring such metrics is that you're taking action on the back of it. So Beehive, our reward and recognition program, was actually an action on the back of a pulse survey to our retail employee audience. Meeting room culture, another really important thing. It's about making sure that we amplify a voice that might not be heard. It's about understanding person's preferences in a meeting. So it could be that an introvert or an extrovert, or what does that mean, and are we enabling those individuals the best we possibly can? Next on my list of things that we can apply is secondments. Now, secondments, I feel, are very powerful in driving awareness and understanding across both yourself and those colleagues that you might not have close connections with, and it enhances a diverse range of opinions, which again we can connect that to innovation within a business, which is commercially very important in competitive markets. Next, company social platforms, staff internet platforms, or again our Beehive rewards and recognition. It can be used to encourage a human connection that's not always possible in the working environment. So it's about how do we support that human connection and drive understanding within diversity. So we have integrated Beehive with our cultural calendar. So when we're delivering, for example, if we're delivering sessions on around National Women's Day, there might be some training or some knowledge sessions around women and women empowerment. Now, there'll be key learnings within those sessions, and they will be supplemented through Beehive. So it's almost like a multi-channel approach, a marketing approach to learning, which we found very effective. Next, I've got new starter or showcase me forms. Now, when somebody new joins an organization, you'll see that you might see in the most basic form what they like, what music, what food, what drinks. That's fine, and I'm not going to speak very critically of it. But I've seen it applied in a more effective manner, where you have a sort of, when I'm low on confidence, what am I doing? What are my characteristics? When I'm stressed, what do I do? And when it's applied like that, it can be very powerful. I'll give an example. So if you're suffering from imposter syndrome, and you go to your leader who is stressed, and when they're stressed, they don't want to talk, or there will be a person of few words. Now, I might be thinking, it's me, the imposter syndrome kicks in. Why, I must have done something. They're not talking to me. But if through that showcase me form, I've then gained an understanding which I wouldn't have had through any other means, and I understand that it's not me, they're just stressed, and that's how they behave when they're stressed. That I find also quite useful. And my final point is profile stories or success stories, in particular around underrepresented groups, and making sure that we're talking about and we're sharing how we're celebrating employees and how their journey, how they've moved through the business and progressed. And yeah, that's a kind of a list of many things that I would say are worthwhile implementing.
Wow, that's quite a list. Thank you, Graham. And I think that's really helpful. And I think it helps because what you have shared is, very tangible, specific action items that either you have seen being implemented in your organization, particularly with the reward and recognition piece, or more widely. And I think we've had a comment around the secondment piece as well. And I think it's quite an interesting one, because if the organizations can offer it, then it's a great opportunity for colleagues to learn more. There were a couple of points which were common, there's a theme coming out, particularly around the thank yous and, just really little things which may not take a whole infrastructure or system to be set up, but just acknowledgement and thank you. I think, Caroline, you had mentioned it when you were talking about the heart element, that just, it doesn't take much, but sometimes as leaders, that in itself extends the inclusion and why it's important. Then you ended on the role modeling piece. Again, that's something that, how do we kind of demonstrate that inclusion? And I think by adopting these practices, it's also demonstrating, the ethical practice of leadership. So it's a very pertinent points. And one last thing from your point was around the meeting room culture. I think while we talk about protected characteristics and diversity of colleagues, I think neurodivergence is also an element. Yes, there's the introvert, extrovert, but there's also there's so much to be aware that for us to be inclusive, we have to be mindful of so many different aspects of it. So if we carry on, Graham, because you've talked about a lot of practices that you've seen and adopted, but the industry that you are in, how do you think it helps the business strategically in achieving the business objectives?
Okay. So building on what I've mentioned earlier, ethical and inclusive leadership allows us to prioritize responsible gambling practices to protect our customers. And that's like in any regulated industry, we're protecting the customers from harm. And it's important that in our industry that we go beyond the regulatory requirements for our customer. By doing the right thing, it enhances our reputation and our customer trust in our brand. So trust, again, is as I've mentioned, is critical and key to customer loyalty. Sustainable customers are important for our business. So we believe that any customer can be sustainable if they make informed decisions about their gambling. This is why we focus on positive play and promoting this to our customers. In terms of how we measure trust within our business, we do measure net trust score, and it's very interesting that of the context or the context around or the reasons why they score us high or low around trust, the comments often touch upon safer gambling practices and the tools available, and that is really positive for us because we as a business have a strategy of educate and empower. Next, I'd say there's the obvious risk, which is, if there's a breach or any challenge around, non-fulfillment of our regulatory obligations, then there's a risk of a fine, or there's a risk of even, going as far as losing a license and not being able to operate. So, commercially, it's also critical. The final point is inclusivity allows us to innovate, and we're in a mature, competitive, oligopic market, and things like compliance and accessibility, they can be used as vehicles for change, whereas before, I'll give an example, brand guidelines might have been very rigid and you wouldn't have been able to pass that change through. But when you change the lens and you look at it from an accessibility point of view, you can then see, okay, we need that contrast to account for, making sure that our products or services are accountable, are accessible for all. So there's very much, those are two things that I would say: use them. Don't be afraid of using them to drive change and innovation. And then, before I move on, customer centricity is very much driven by our people. So, having a healthy, happier, more engaged workforce means that growth and retention of our people is a result of that, and they have a feeling of belonging and acceptance of diversity.
Thank you, Graham. And I think it was a good touch. You talked about the sustainability element as well, that the broad-ranging impact of ethical and inclusive leadership and how it benefits the strategic outcomes can sometimes be overlooked or not necessarily realized and recognized fully. So, Caroline, I know Graham's talked about what are some of the practices and the strategic benefit. The same question to you, really, then what do you think are the positive impacts on business objectives you have experienced as a result of ethical and inclusive leadership?
Thank you, Sarah. And I think for the NHS, it's probably slightly different, and in terms of but it is, we have got our customers are our population across the NHS in the UK. And I think that there's sort of, again, a few areas. We base our whole work on the NHS constitution. So there is a constitution. It's the gives and the gets for the public and our patients and our service users. And it works at the limits of science, bringing together the highest levels of human knowledge to improve lives. And basically, we talk about it touches our lives at the times of most basic need, when care and compassion are what matter the most, because most people that interact with the health service aren't well. So there's something about how our model has to be able to relate to that with the values that are across the NHS, and particularly in this, we're talking about ethical and inclusion today, is around everybody counts, and there is a value based on that. And I think, again, we don't always get it right. A lot of what we get wrong goes into the public domain. So, and I won't profess to excuse some of that, particularly some of the most recent publications, and we do have to do better. But I do think there is something about us because we're also a regulator, so people might not have thought about ethics when I'm talking. We have got all of the ethical side of medicine, of course, that is within the innovation and the technology. But, our most recent pandemic was around the vaccination and how quickly we could actually make a decision to vaccinate. That will have gone through ethical councils, and it did have an impact on our staff when it was proposed that it would be mandated, particularly our colleagues from Black and ethnic minority groups. So we had to think about, how do we do that? How do you mandate something to protect the public? And how do you ethically make those decisions when actually it could be against somebody's religion or faith? So there is something about how do we do that within the public sector and within my world of it. And we do put some ambitions, and more than some ambitions. We have now published an ED&I improvement plan. So that's looking at talent, it's looking at well-being, it's looking at other areas. And we've set out an ambition to be 19%. We have bandings in the NHS, and they go from 2 right through to exec level. And at every banding, we're aiming for a 19% of Black, Asian, minority, ethnic. And the reason we're doing that is to get our population up in terms of all bands, because actually we're great at the lower bands, but we're not very good at senior bands. And what we're proposing is that we need more senior people to be able to make ethical and inclusive decisions. Therefore, we need more diverse boards. Again, that's in the public domain, that we're aiming for that. But also some of the areas, and perhaps one of the practices that I've been promoting within my team, is to have a, if you like, a shadow leadership team. So colleagues that are from a Black, Asian, minority, ethnic group, but actually they're shadowing the senior leadership team, and therefore they get insights, they get board papers, they get papers that they can make a decision on, and it brings them through. And one of the successes of that is being promotion into higher banded roles over the last 2 to 3 years. So there's something about retaining colleagues as well, as Graham has mentioned, but again, maybe a practice that people could think about. So sort of that ethical decision making, the constitution, maybe some ideas about boards. I could sort of talk more about staff surveys, etc., but I think Graham has covered some of those areas as well. And then the last area, however big or small you are as an organisation, have you got your staff networks? Is your voice heard? So, and are you sponsoring it as a senior leader if you're in a bigger organisation? So for myself, I am the sponsor for the Multicultural Esperanto group, which is hidden migrants, built around Brexit and settled status, in terms of colleagues that were not from England or Great Britain, but from the European communities, and that's spread wider and wider now across. So we're about 180 strong as a network, but we've got staff networks for all the protected characteristics. I appreciate we're slightly bigger than some organisations might be, but actually, have you got that voice within your organisation to help you achieve your business objectives? Because if you haven't got diversity of voice when you're making your decisions, how can they be ethical and inclusive? Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you, Caroline. That was really interesting, actually. And I think, it was good because you started on the ethical aspect as well, because I know both go in hand in hand, but it is really important to understand the importance of ethical leadership and what are some of the practices that are being adopted. I do like the idea of a shadow leadership board. It sounds quite interesting as well. And I think even more broadly, generally, it would offer opportunities to colleagues in the organization. But again, it depends on the size of the organization. And we have seen a rise of the staff networks, I think, across organizations. Again, it can vary from different organization to organization, but some really interesting insight, again, in terms of how it contributes to the business objectives and why it helps us and how it can help us. So I'm going to now try and take some questions that was submitted to us. And I know that we've also got some questions that are being submitted during the session. So please keep your questions going. If we have time, we'll definitely take some of those. But I'd like to take a couple from those that have been submitted previously. And the first one is that how best can we tackle the issue of existing managers not having adequate training? There needs to be an open, honest, and non-judgmental conversation to improve the situation. Graham, do you want to go on that?
Yeah, happy to take that one. So I think, as I touched on earlier, it's about leveraging the training that is available to you. Obviously, if you're a larger organization, there might be opportunities to lean on the levy funding to access certain training courses, but there is degree apprenticeships out there. We've taken on one last year, at the end of last year in September, me personally within my team with Manchester Metropolitan University, and it's a very, very effective way to impact the business, but also impact those individuals who are lucky enough to take part and get on the apprenticeship. So outside of that, I think there's a lot of content, as Caroline mentioned earlier. There's a lot of content available through the NHS there, and online just in general. There's a lot of content. So I think it's a challenge for all businesses, and there is, content and courses and training out there that can help. It's not a quick win. These are things that need to be worked towards over a longer period of time.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, and Caroline, is there anything that you would like to add on this?
I think Graham's covered most of it. The only other thing, when I was a small business owner, I did take on apprenticeships. So people that could have an apprenticeship with us as an organisation, and that is a way of developing the skill sets, but also thinking about longer term retention of your staff and organisation as well. So there might be some ways. So Darren mentions the access to apprenticeships. Do you want to host some apprenticeships and think about that in a different way that might bring information to your organisation as a smaller organisation?
Absolutely. And I think, the CMI has a lot of content, some of which I know has been shared, that, there is a lot of online content available that you can help to develop yourself, your teams, in smaller teams as well. The management diagnostic tool is a very useful tool that enables you to identify what are some of the development areas. So it's just leveraging the resources that might be available. I'm going to move on to another question, which was submitted from Ross. Is ethical leadership always inclusive? Caroline.
I like this question. Yes and no, I guess, is the answer to it, in terms of obviously this is my personal view, but it was an interesting one to actually have a look at, because we did get that one. And so I'd say not always. I think what I have experienced in various organizations is that we have our values, and we'll talk about being inclusive. We'll talk about cultures. We'll have some people will have everything stuck on a wall, and that's how you're going to behave, and that's what you're going to do. But how that feels to a member of staff within the organization could be completely different. So I think we might talk about having ethical and inclusive leadership, and we might have it promoted within our organization, but actually, do people live those espoused values? Do they walk the walk and talk the talk? So I think we might be able to make some ethical decisions that have to be inclusive. So that would have to come together, in my view, in terms of that decision making, because it should shape our actions and it should sort of help our overall communities. But actually, my experience is that it depends on which lens you look through of the ethics. So what might be just to somebody may not be just to somebody else in terms of how they feel. So I think it'll depend from the lens of which you're viewing it. Where do you come from? I may feel it very differently, as I said earlier, as a white female, to a colleague from a Black or minority ethnic group within it. So how does it feel? If you sort of think about the ethical lenses that are promoted, you've got justice, you've got common good, and you've got virtue. It just may not feel the same. So should it go hand in hand? Yes, it probably should. Does it in the reality? I challenge that in any staff survey, probably, of how does it feel? Because remembering that what we do as leaders and managers, it'll be, people will remember how you made them feel, not what you said to them. That's what they'll remember. So that's why it's important to have that ethical inclusion, to strive for it. But we don't always get it right, and it may not always land in the same way for everybody. So I think that's something we're going to work on. That's a every day's a school day one.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question and a thought-provoking one. And like you say, that it should be, but I guess it's for us to answer and be objective about it, that are we actually achieving it or not? And I think something you mentioned there about the impact of words is really important as well. And I know I saw some of the comments in the chat earlier about, thank yous, but they should be genuine thank yous. Absolutely. But at the same, it's any word, the impact that a leader can have is so significant. But no, thank you to Ross for submitting that question. So our third question, which is from Kelly, is what damage does exclusive leadership do? And what does excellent inclusive leadership really look like? So, Caroline, I'm going to come to you again for this one.
Okay, thank you. So I've got a view. I've had a few experiences where when we talk about talent, so let's talk about it. It's often in the form of talent in terms of the conversation when you think about it in sort of the CMI portfolio. But sort of if it's exclusive, it can be great for the people that are in those pools, of course. But if it's exclusive, then by its very nature, you're excluding others. So if you've got a pool of perhaps top leaders that actually have been set up for success, but then they don't move through or they don't get to where they want to go to, then I think damage can be done, because then their confidence will start to fail if they haven't been promoted in the way, or perhaps overpromised because of the exclusiveness of perhaps the program that they've been put on, or the talent pool that they've been put in. So, and I think it can then have an effect on colleagues that aren't in the pool. So what's the damage if I'm not there, if I'm not in that exclusive top echelons of often put in? I think, how do I get there? Is it because, and again, is there some damage being caused to my confidence? Is it inclusive? Well, it won't be, because by its very nature it isn't. Now there's views on both ways, that I think you should have talent and top talent at every level, and you should have career progression for all that want it, because not everybody wants it. But I have seen it work in terms of some of perhaps the leadership roles that get in, but I actually see it work less well if you don't think about it in its totality, which takes to the second half of the question is, and what does excellent inclusive leadership really look like? So I think I've touched on some of the areas that are my views, but also, again, if you take it, depending which lens you take it down, if you take it through a talent lens and you believe that leadership is for all, then actually you can start promote that in a way that everybody's valued and everybody's voice is heard, and you create that sense of belonging and camaraderie. Now, not everybody can get the promotion or the next promotion, but if it's excellent, then you've got clear ways of doing appraisal, conversations, talent conversations, development, and you've got that accessibility within all of it. And leadership doesn't just happen. So are you developing your leaders? So excellent leadership is because you need to have that development as well. So I guess it's sort of, I think it can be damaging if it's not done well. But I think if you can get it right, it is absolutely brilliant, and it will feel inclusive. The only way you'll know that is by asking your staff, and actually maybe doing a 360 for yourself. Are you an inclusive leader, and are you demonstrating that? And that will be shown by your own 360. So there's ways of finding out, but also I think there is ways of, some people lead in an fear culture, which would be the exclusive side of it. Some people lead in a collaborative and open culture. So I think it's a great question, but probably I think it's almost a debate. We could debate that one across all of us for the next few hours, a bit like the question from Ross earlier.
Yeah, and I think you're right, Caroline. And I think these questions just demonstrate the breadth of the topic, and why it is so important that we talk about it and we keep discussing it to help ourselves and other managers, to develop that thinking. Graham, is there anything you want to add onto that? Or
I think with regard to excellence or excellent leaders, the key for me is listening and vulnerability, being able to show that vulnerable side. And how many times are you listening, and are you actually listening when you're listening? Listening is probably one of the most difficult skill sets around, and I think that is key to anything here. I'm happy to, Sarah, take a question from the live chat around regulated. How does a regulated company resolve failure? I think on that note, I don't think there's any difference between a regulated organization and a non-regulated organization in terms of how they handle failure from an inclusive and ethical point. I think what's critical in our regulated industry is that you have the processes and systems in place, you have the right risk mitigation in place, you have the compliance training across the organization, so you have a really strong compliance culture. But what you can't have is, you know, any form of blame culture or any form of reacting to that, because as an organization, you need to be clear on all of your risk, the scale of the risk, and ensure you have the systems and sign-offs and approvals that need to be in place. I think I've answered that question. And then also there's a question from Richard around recruitment. I have seen being used, companies using pre-recorded questions, and it, you know, I'm not sold on it yet. I don't know whether it's good or bad, because there are times when I'm in a interview and the candidate is fantastic, but they, you know, they just need that hint or that nudge to go in the right direction. And then that once they've hit that, the flying, where that sort of, you know, tech reliant sort of pre-recorded interview process where there's no human touch and it lacks emotion, I'm not sold on it yet. But I think it's a very interesting topic, because as leaders, we all know how time consuming the first stage of interview processes can be. You know, we're all very busy, and that can be very frustrating. So I can see the problem it solves, but at the same time, I'm not convinced on it yet. I think it still has its limitations.
Yeah, and I think you're right, Graham. Thanks for taking those questions. I think where Richard's also coming from is sharing the questions in advance. So maybe it's not the recorded interviews, it's where the question set is made available so that people can come prepared for it. And I think that also has its, you know, pros and cons probably, but definitely from an inclusion perspective, I've heard that, you know, for neurodivergent colleagues, it reduces the anxiety, the preparation, and what they need to do. So, and I think that what it highlights in terms of inclusion is that, you know, it's not one size fits all anyway. So it's tailoring it for the colleagues, making sure that, you know, you make them feel comfortable, and while making sure that we are following the ethical practices. So I'm very conscious of time, but I do want to take one more question that we have around, and I think, Caroline, it might have stemmed from you mentioning some of the targets about how do you ensure positive action and avoid positive discrimination where targets are set for appointing people from underrepresented groups across different bands and grades?
I think it's a great question, and it does very much come back to your recruitment practices. So you've got to, it can't, my view, this isn't about tokenism. This isn't about sort of that, you have to avoid the positive discrimination, but actually, how do you do that in a way? So some of it is making sure that there is access to development. So staff surveys that I've had will have demonstrated that colleagues from Black ethnic minority groups have had less access to development. So how do you set that up? So how do you, which is positive action to make sure that people do get all of the development that they absolutely should be having. So that actually once people are there, they're set up for success. And one of the real reasons for doing the shadow boards, actually it was Yorkshire and Humber Leadership Academy that led on this area, was to be able to do that, to set colleagues up for success so that we know what to expect when we get there. Because otherwise what happens is that we haven't got the experience, knowledge, skills, behaviours to be able to do that without having, and it becomes that I can't get the job without experience and I can't get experience without the job. So you've absolutely got to be able to find ways. And some of that might be stretch assignments. It might be secondments. There are opportunities to be able to do that. So it's very much positive action, not positive discrimination when we're working through it. Will we always get it right? No, but that's the ambition.
Thank you. And I think that's the important point, and you've alluded to it a couple of times. Will we always get it right? No, but we can't stop ourselves from doing something until we know how to find that right solution and, one that helps us succeed. Graham, is there anything else that you want to add on this question?
No, I think Caroline's covered it quite well there. I don't have anything else to add. Thank you.
Okay, so I want to take one more question, and then I think we'll look to conclude this session. But there's a question around, when comparing progress towards being ethical and inclusive, are there any metrics that are useful or less useful? I think it's a very interesting question. I think we've touched on survey results, pulse, culture measures, but I would be keen to understand, and if Caroline, if I may come to you first, if that's okay.
Thank you. And thank you for that question. I've just realised how Graham was able to see the other questions that I wasn't able to see. So apologies that I didn't pick up on any of the questions. So I think there definitely are some metrics that are useful. It's a bit like models, aren't they? That some models are wrong and some are useful. But I think that there's something around retention in terms of ethical and inclusive leadership. So do people have a feeling of belonging? Have you got high turnover? So I think retention as a metric can be useful, but you need to look at it in its entirety. If, are people leaving but getting promotions, or leaving to go to another part of your organization, or are people just leaving? So are we doing an exit interview, for example, and able to do that? I think health and well-being, in terms of occupational health, if you have access to that, but certainly health and well-being in terms of temperature checks, which are quite easy to do now. You can do your surveys around that in terms of health and well-being. I say that there's no health without mental and physical health, so there's something about that. And then what's your absenteeism rates? Have you got presenteeism as well? Because often we'll see that if you don't feel as confident in your role or culture, or don't feel as included, you're more likely to come to work when you're unwell than if not. And I think that's that presenteeism. There's some work that the Post Office did several years ago now, and Professor Steve led on. And I think it's an interesting one to look at in terms of presenteeism. So you've got all the usual workforce metrics at your hand as a manager. So retention, health and well-being, presenteeism, you can look at your absent rates, you can look at there are workforce metrics. I think less useful. I think it's difficult because I would be looking at the holistic approach to your workforce metrics as opposed to just taking one single one. So if it was less useful, I'd say just don't focus on one, because it's not going to give you the whole picture that you're going to need to see if you're being ethical and inclusive. And then be brave enough to ask the questions. And if you're hearing it, the other metric for me is if people are coming back in temperature checks and not feeling safe in your environment, you've got to listen and then work out what you're going to do about it, not just have that question being asked and asked and asked. So if you've got a metric that you keep asking that isn't shifting over time, then what isn't working? So have your metrics, but also have your trends. So it's a point in time, isn't it, a staff survey? So how do you use the trends to be able to do it, not just one point in time? So again, doesn't matter how big or small your organization is, you could be able to do a bit of a trend analysis with all the people that are cleverer than me in terms of techie stuff can do that. But those would be the ones, some of the workforce metrics, and then you've got to do them over time. Hope that helps, James. I'm not sure it fully answers your question, but that's off the top of my head, not having seen the question earlier.
That's perfect. No, I think that's quite helpful, actually. And it's an interesting lens to apply the workforce metrics, because the reality is that ethical and inclusive leadership is measuring the overall culture and making sure that our culture allows for it. And I think you quickly touched on the smaller organizations as well, because I know there was a lot of chat in there. So I would just like to thank you both very much for such an interesting conversation. I hope everybody enjoyed it. I think there were some valuable takeaways, particularly around the role that we can play as leaders, the role that managers can play, and the importance of ethical and inclusive leadership, and how it can help the business move forward. So I think that is all for us today.
Thank you very much. That is it for today's session. Thank you to Sarah, Caroline and Graham for your insights and expertise. We've had lots of requests for all of the materials mentioned, so we'll be sure to send those out. Please stay tuned to hear more about CMI membership, and thank you again for joining us.
Don't forget, as a CMI member, you can find the latest management and leadership insights at managers.org.uk. If you're not yet a member, join our community to discover CMI Confidence with on-demand resources, our network of mentors, and industry-leading accreditations.